My sister screamed, "You're making my kids homeless." I looked around at the relatives she'd brought to shame me, then replied, "If you care so much, one of you can give her your house. Mine isn't available. I'm 30 years old, and if you'd asked me a year ago who in my family hated me the most, I wouldn't have hesitated for a second. My stepsister, Vanessa. She's 31 now, and she spent more than 20 years making sure everyone knew I was never her real brother. The funny thing is, she only started calling me family when she wanted my house. My mom married my stepdad, Richard, when I was 8. Richard had one daughter, Vanessa, who was a year older than me. I remember being genuinely excited because I'd always wanted an older sibling. My biological father had died when I was 3, so when mom told me I'd finally have a dad and a sister, I thought my life was about to get a lot better. Instead, it turned into something completely different. On the day our parents got married, I walked over to Vanessa with a little gift I'd bought using birthday money I'd been saving for months. It was just a small friendship bracelet with both our initials engraved on it. Nothing expensive. But to an 8-year-old, it felt important. She looked at it for about 2 seconds before handing it back and saying, "I'm not your sister. Don't call me that." I still remember standing there in my little suit while adults laughed awkwardly, assuming she was just being shy. She wasn't shy. She meant every word. From that day forward, she made it her personal mission to remind me exactly where I stood. If anyone at school called us brother and sister, she'd immediately correct them. If relatives introduced us together, she'd interrupt and explain that we weren't actually related. Whenever friends came over, she'd tell them I was just my dad's wife's kid. She never once introduced me as her brother. Not once. At first, I kept trying because I was a kid and kids are optimistic. I'd ask if she wanted to play games together. She'd say no. I'd ask if she wanted to ride bikes. She'd leave without me. I tried including her whenever my friends came over because I figured maybe if we spent more time together, she'd warm up. Instead, she'd tell my friends embarrassing stories that weren't even true just to make them laugh at me. She once convinced half my 5th grade class that I'd cried because I lost a spelling bee. I'd never even entered one. Another time, she told everyone I'd wet the bed until I was 10. Again, completely made up. She loved creating stories because she knew people rarely bothered checking whether they were true. Richard corrected her occasionally, but never in a way that mattered. He'd say things like, "Be nice to your brother," and she'd immediately answer, "He's not my brother." Richard would sigh, tell her to stop arguing, and that would be the end of it. There were never consequences. My mom always told me Vanessa was still adjusting to the divorce and needed patience. Apparently, patience lasted well over 2 decades. Things got worse after my younger half-sister, Emma, was born. Vanessa adored Emma because they shared the same father. She'd constantly tell Emma that she had one real sister and one fake brother. Emma was too young to understand, but hearing those words over and over eventually confused her enough that she started asking why Vanessa hated me. Even then, nobody truly addressed the problem. Everyone just wanted peace. I learned pretty quickly that in our house, keeping Vanessa happy was more important than holding her accountable, so I stopped trying. By the time I reached high school, we barely spoke unless we absolutely had to. She went to parties while I spent weekends working at a hardware store. I saved every paycheck because I wanted out of that house as soon as possible. Vanessa laughed whenever she saw me working overtime. She used to tell me I was wasting my youth while she was actually enjoying life. Maybe she was right. I didn't have the exciting teenage years she did. I didn't travel. I didn't buy expensive clothes. I didn't finance new cars I couldn't afford. I worked, studied, and saved. After graduation, I earned a scholarship to study mechanical engineering at a state university. I worked nights, graduated with very little debt, landed a good job designing manufacturing equipment, and slowly built a career. I wasn't rich, but I was financially stable before I turned 30. More importantly, I stayed out of debt. Every raise went into savings. Every bonus went toward a future down payment. 4 years ago, I finally bought my first house. It wasn't huge. 3 bedrooms, 1 office, a decent backyard, and a garage that needed work. It was older than most homes in the neighborhood, but it had solid bones. I spent almost every weekend renovating it myself. I replaced flooring, remodeled the kitchen, repainted every room, landscaped the yard, and even rebuilt the deck with help from a coworker. By the time I finished, it looked nothing like the house I'd purchased. I was proud of every inch because I'd earned every inch. Meanwhile, Vanessa's life went in the opposite direction. She married a guy named Kyle, who made decent money running a small roofing company. Together, they earned enough to live comfortably, but comfortable apparently wasn't enough. They leased luxury SUVs, financed expensive furniture, took vacations every summer, and constantly posted pictures online about living their best life. Every Christmas, she'd show off designer handbags. Every birthday party for her 3 kids looked like it cost more than my first car. Whenever relatives complimented my house, she'd shrug and say it was cute for someone who lived alone. The one time she actually visited after I finished renovating, she walked through every room without saying anything positive. Before leaving, she looked around and said, "Seems like a waste for one person to have all this space." At the time, I thought it was just another unnecessary comment. Looking back, I realized she'd already started looking at my house as something she deserved more than I did. We rarely spoke after that. Holidays were about the only time we occupied the same room, And even then she'd barely acknowledge me unless she needed something lifted, fixed, or assembled. Funny how I wasn't family until furniture needed moving. Last winter, everything changed. Kyle's roofing business started losing money after several large commercial contracts fell through. Instead of cutting expenses, they doubled down. They refinanced vehicles, maxed out credit cards, and somehow convinced themselves another big contract would solve everything. It didn't. Within 6 months, the business collapsed completely. Creditors came after the equipment, their vehicles were repossessed, and they fell almost 5 months behind on rent. Kyle eventually packed a suitcase one morning, told Vanessa he couldn't handle the pressure anymore, and left. Nobody heard from him for weeks. Vanessa suddenly found herself unemployed with 3 children and nowhere to go after the landlord finalized the eviction. Naturally, she moved back into Richard and my mom's house. Unfortunately, that house only had 4 bedrooms. One belonged to my parents, one belonged to Emma, who was attending community college. One had been converted into Richard's office after retirement, leaving Vanessa and her 3 children squeezed into the remaining bedroom. According to my mother, everyone was miserable within 2 weeks. The children fought constantly because there wasn't enough space. Vanessa complained about everything from the food to the internet speed. She expected my mother to babysit while she looked for work, although months passed without a single interview. Richard quietly covered her insurance payments because she said she couldn't risk losing the SUV while job hunting. Every phone conversation I had with my mom somehow turned into another complaint about how exhausted she was. I sympathized, but I stayed out of it. It wasn't my problem. Then one Saturday afternoon, my mom called and asked if she and Richard could stop by because they needed to discuss something important. I honestly thought someone was sick. Instead, they sat at my dining table looking unusually nervous. My mom couldn't even meet my eyes. Richard cleared his throat and finally said, "We've been thinking about Vanessa's situation." I nodded, but stayed quiet. He continued, "Your house has plenty of room." The second he said those words, I felt something sink in my stomach. I already knew exactly where the conversation was going, and I had a feeling it was about to change my relationship with my family forever. Richard leaned forward and folded his hands together like he was about to negotiate a business deal instead of asking me for an enormous favor. "Your mother and I were thinking that maybe Vanessa and the kids could stay here for a little while," he said, "just until she gets back on her feet." I looked at him, then at my mom, who still wouldn't make eye contact with me. "How long is a little while?" I asked. Richard shrugged. "A few months, maybe." That answer alone told me nobody had actually thought this through. A few months was vague enough to become a year. I asked whether Vanessa had found a job yet. My mom quietly admitted she hadn't. I asked whether she was actively interviewing anywhere. Another uncomfortable silence. Richard finally answered that she'd been focusing on getting the children settled first. That sounded suspicious, considering she'd already been living with them for almost 3 months. Then my mom finally spoke. She actually had another idea. "I already knew I wasn't going to like whatever came next," she thinks. "Maybe it would be easier if you stayed with us for a while instead." I blinked a couple of times because I honestly thought I'd misunderstood. "Stayed with you?" My mom nodded carefully. "Just temporarily. That way the children wouldn't have to keep moving around and your house already has enough bedrooms." I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, but because it was so absurd that my brain didn't know how else to react. "So let me make sure I understand this," I said. "Vanessa doesn't want to stay with me. She wants me to move out of my own house so she can move into it." Richard immediately tried to soften it. "It's not like that." "Then explain how it's different." He opened his mouth, thought about it for a moment, then closed it again. My mom tried instead. "Honey, you're one person. She's raising 3 children. With my house." Another silence. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the dining room I'd spent months renovating. Every cabinet had been installed by me. Every light fixture. Every floorboard. I could still remember spending entire weekends covered in drywall dust because I couldn't afford contractors. And now they were asking me to pack a suitcase and leave because my stepsister had decided she deserved it more. Did Vanessa actually ask for this? I already knew the answer. Richard sighed. It was her suggestion. Of course it was. My mom reached across the table and touched my hand. "She's under a lot of stress." I gently pulled my hand away. "Mom, she spent 20 years telling me I wasn't family." That was a long time ago, really. Because last Christmas, her youngest son asked who I was, and she introduced me as Grandpa Richard's wife's son. That was 7 months ago. Neither of them said anything. Has she apologized for any of it, I asked. No. Has she admitted she treated me badly? More silence. Has she even called me? My mom quietly answered. No. I nodded. So she doesn't think she owes me an apology, but she thinks I owe her my house. Richard became visibly irritated. Nobody's asking you to give away your house. If I move out and she moves in without paying rent, without a lease, and without an end date, what exactly am I doing? He insisted it would only be temporary, but I noticed neither of them could define temporary. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. A year became impossible to undo because nobody wanted to force children to move again. I'd seen enough stories to know exactly how that would end. I calmly told them no. Not maybe. Not after I thought about it. Just no. My mother immediately started crying. Richard looked disappointed, almost offended. I thought we raised you to help family, he said. That sentence irritated me more than anything else he'd said all afternoon. Family, I asked. Interesting word. Where was all this family talk when Vanessa spent 20 years telling everyone I wasn't her brother? He looked away. She was a kid. She's 31 now. People change. Has she, I asked? Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing that's changed is that she needs something. My mom quietly asked whether I'd at least consider letting Vanessa and the children stay while I remained in the house. I shook my head immediately. Absolutely not. Why, she asked. Because she'd never leave. Richard frowned. That's a pretty unfair assumption. I looked directly at him. She already believes she deserves my house. You don't think she'd suddenly decide the kids need stability after 6 months? Or a year? Then what happens? You ask me to wait a little longer because moving them would be unfair. Neither of them answered, because they both knew exactly how every future conversation would go. The reasonable person always had to compromise. That had been the rule my entire childhood. Richard finally stood up. I'm disappointed in you. I'm disappointed you even asked. They left shortly afterward. My mom hugged me before leaving, but it felt different, like she knew she'd crossed a line. Richard simply walked to his truck without another word. I honestly believed that would be the end of it. I'd said no. They'd heard me. Life would move on. Instead, everything exploded 3 days later. I was sitting in a meeting at work when my phone started vibrating nonstop. Since I couldn't answer, I ignored it until lunch. When I finally checked it, I had 18 missed calls and over 40 text messages. Most were from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. The very first text simply read, "How could you do this?" Another said, "Those poor children deserve better." A cousin I'd barely spoken to in years called me selfish. One aunt said she expected more compassion from me. Completely confused, I opened social media for the first time in weeks. Right at the top of my feed was a public post from Vanessa. She hadn't used my name, but she didn't have to. She wrote about being abandoned by her husband struggling to raise 3 children, and having a wealthy relative with a large empty house who refused to help because he cared more about property than family. She wrote that her children were sleeping on the floor because someone who claims to love family slammed the door in our faces. That part especially annoyed me because nobody had ever stood at my door. She finished by saying she hoped her children would never grow up as cold-hearted as some people. Thousands of people had reacted to the post. Hundreds of comments called me heartless without even knowing my name. The worst part wasn't strangers. It was relatives agreeing with her. People who had watched her reject me my entire childhood were suddenly acting like I was obligated to rescue her because she had children. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I took screenshots of everything. Something told me this wasn't over. About an hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Vanessa herself. Against my better judgment, I answered. She didn't even say hello. "You embarrassed Mom," she said. I almost laughed. "I embarrassed Mom. She cried because you refused to help us." "No," I replied. "She cried because she realized how ridiculous this request was." Vanessa's tone instantly became colder. "You really are going to make my kids suffer over a childhood grudge. This isn't about childhood. Then what's it about? It's about the fact that you're asking me to leave my own home." She sighed dramatically like I was the unreasonable one. "You don't even need all that space. That's not your decision. You're being selfish." "Maybe," I answered calmly, "but selfish people usually don't spend 20 years telling someone they aren't family before asking for their house." She went quiet for a moment before saying something that honestly made me smile. "Dad agrees with me." That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. She genuinely believed she was going to win because she'd spent her entire life getting her way whenever Richard wanted to avoid conflict. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't 8 years old anymore, and this wasn't his house to volunteer. I ended the call without another word because there was nothing left to say. If Vanessa honestly believed Richard agreeing with her was going to change my mind, she hadn't been paying attention to the last 15 years of my life. Richard could be disappointed all he wanted, but disappointment didn't put his name on my mortgage. I figured she'd spend a few days complaining before eventually accepting reality. I couldn't have been more wrong. The following Saturday, I was mowing my lawn when I noticed an SUV slowly pull into my driveway. Then another one. Then a pickup truck with a small utility trailer behind it. My stomach immediately tightened because I recognized Vanessa's vehicle. Before I could even turn off the mower, all 3 vehicles stopped, and people started climbing out carrying cardboard boxes. At first, I genuinely thought they were dropping off donations somewhere else on the street. Then Vanessa waved at me like we were old friends and shouted, "Perfect timing!" I shut off the mower and walked toward the driveway completely confused. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Moving in," she answered as casually as if we'd already discussed it. I honestly stared at her for several seconds because I thought she had to be joking. She wasn't. 2 of our cousins had already started unloading plastic storage bins from the trailer. One of my aunts was carrying grocery bags toward my front porch. Even Richard climbed out of his truck looking uncomfortable while avoiding eye contact. My mother wasn't there. That was the first thing I noticed. I asked Vanessa whether she'd completely lost her mind. She rolled her eyes and said, "Everyone talked about it, and we agreed this is the best solution." "Who's everyone?" I asked. "The people who actually care about family." One cousin awkwardly smiled and told me they thought I'd changed my mind after talking things over with Richard. I looked at him and said, "Did I ever tell you that?" His smile disappeared immediately. "Well, no. Did anyone actually ask me?" Nobody answered. Vanessa stepped closer and lowered her voice like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "Look, everyone knows you're stubborn. We figured once the kids were actually here, you'd stop acting like this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She hadn't come to ask again. She'd decided to skip my answer entirely and rely on social pressure to force me into accepting her. She genuinely thought that if enough relatives showed up carrying boxes, I'd be too embarrassed to send them away. Unfortunately for her, she had seriously misjudged me. I walked straight past everyone, unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and locked it again behind me. Through the front window, I could see people looking confused. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. "Vanessa," I answered. "Open the door," she said. "No. Stop making a scene. You're the one trying to move into someone else's house." She sighed loudly. "The kids are standing outside in the heat. Then maybe you should take them somewhere that actually belongs to you." She started raising her voice. "You're seriously going to do this?" "Yes." "Fine." She hung up. About 5 minutes later, there was loud knocking on my front door. Then more knocking. Then Richard's voice asking if we could all just talk calmly. I opened the door just enough to step onto the porch behind me, making sure nobody could push past me. Richard looked exhausted. "Son?" he started. "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't call me son when you're standing in front of my house trying to help someone move in after I already said no." His face immediately fell. He admitted the whole thing had been Vanessa's idea, but insisted he only came because he hoped I'd reconsider once everyone was present. I asked him one question. "If I showed up at your house with a trailer full of my furniture, after you told me no, what would you do?" He didn't answer. Vanessa answered for him. "That's completely different." How, I asked. "Because you don't have children." There it was again. Every argument somehow came back to the fact that she had children, as though giving birth automatically entitled someone to other people's property. I looked around at everyone standing in my driveway. Did any of you ask whether Vanessa offered to pay rent? Silence. Did any of you ask whether she'd contribute to utilities? More silence. Did anyone ask how long she planned to stay? My aunt quietly admitted they assumed it would only be a few months. I turned toward Vanessa. "How long?" She crossed her arms. "Until I'm financially stable. Which means, however long that takes. 6 months." She shrugged. "Maybe a year?" Another shrug. "If necessary. 2 years?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Everyone else finally understood exactly what I'd understood from the beginning. There was no plan. There was no deadline. There was only the expectation that once she got inside, removing her would become my problem. I looked directly at my cousins. "You all helped carry boxes because you thought I had agreed. I didn't. I never agreed. I told my parents no 3 separate times. Vanessa knew that. Both of them immediately set the boxes back onto the trailer. One quietly apologized for getting involved. My aunt looked horrified. "Vanessa, is that true?" Vanessa became defensive almost instantly. "He's twisting everything I simply pulled out." My phone opened the text conversation I'd had with my mother days earlier and handed it to my aunt. The messages clearly showed my mother asking me to reconsider and me repeatedly refusing. There was no misunderstanding, no mixed signals, just a very clear no. My aunt read the messages, looked at Vanessa, then slowly handed my phone back without saying a word. One by one, relatives started putting everything back into the vehicles. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody told me to reconsider. They had all realized they'd been manipulated into participating in something they never would have agreed to if they'd known the truth. Vanessa completely lost control. She started yelling that everyone was abandoning her. She accused my cousins of being cowards. She accused me of humiliating her on purpose. She even blamed Richard for not acting like a father. That's when something happened I honestly never expected. Richard raised his voice louder than I had ever heard in my entire life. Enough. The entire driveway went silent. He looked directly at Vanessa and said, "He told us no. I should have respected that. This is over." She stared at him in complete disbelief. "You're taking his side?" Richard closed his eyes for a second before answering quietly. "I'm taking the side that's actually right." For the first time since I was 8 years old, he wasn't asking the reasonable person to give in just to keep the peace. Unfortunately, it had taken 3 decades and a driveway full of embarrassed relatives for him to finally get there. Vanessa looked around the driveway waiting for someone to defend her, but nobody did. My cousins quietly loaded the last few boxes back onto the trailer, while my aunt avoided looking at her altogether. Even the children had stopped talking because they could tell something serious had just happened. Richard stood there with his shoulders slumped, looking older than I had ever seen him. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked defeated. Vanessa wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially not from him. So instead of accepting it, she doubled down. She pointed at me and shouted that I had manipulated everyone against her. She claimed I'd been waiting years for the chance to get revenge because she'd never accepted me as a brother. I almost laughed at the irony. "You're right about one thing," I said. "You never accepted me as your brother. That's exactly why none of this makes sense." She frowned. I continued before she could interrupt. "For over 20 years, you told everyone I wasn't family. You corrected teachers. You corrected relatives. You corrected your own children whenever they accidentally called me Uncle Nathan. You made sure nobody thought we were brother and sister. Then the second you needed a free house, suddenly I'm family again. Which is it? She opened her mouth but couldn't answer. Am I your brother or not? I asked again. She looked away. That's what I thought. My mother finally arrived a few minutes later. She had been grocery shopping when Richard left with Vanessa, and judging by the expression on her face, she already knew something had gone terribly wrong. She walked straight toward me before anyone else and quietly asked whether I was okay. I told her I was fine, but that this could never happen again. She nodded immediately. Then, to my surprise, she turned toward everyone gathered in the driveway and admitted the truth. She said she had asked me to reconsider several times, but I had refused every single time. She admitted I had never led anyone to believe Vanessa could move in. Most importantly, she admitted giving Vanessa hope had been her mistake, not mine. Hearing my mother say that out loud changed the atmosphere completely. The last few relatives, who had still looked uncertain, immediately understood what had happened. Vanessa hadn't simply misunderstood my answer. She had ignored it because she believed enough public pressure would force me to change my mind. My oldest cousin shook his head and said, "Vanessa, you told us he'd agreed." She didn't deny it. Instead, she started crying. Real tears this time, not the frustrated kind she'd been producing earlier. For a brief moment, I actually felt sorry for her. Losing your husband, your home, and your financial security all within a few months would break most people. Then she pointed at me and screamed that everything was my fault, because if I had just acted like family, none of this would have happened. Whatever sympathy I'd started feeling disappeared instantly. I calmly asked everyone one question. If any of you believe she deserves free housing, why hasn't anyone offered your own house? Nobody spoke. They all loved volunteering mine, but none of them seemed interested in volunteering there. My aunt quietly admitted they lived in a 2-bedroom condo. One cousin said his apartment wouldn't allow additional occupants. Another relative explained they already had 4 children themselves. Every answer was perfectly reasonable. None of them wanted to sacrifice their own homes. Somehow, I was the selfish one for feeling exactly the same way. Within another 10 minutes, every box was back in the trailer, every vehicle pulled out of my driveway, and the only people left were my mother, Richard, and me. Richard stood silently for almost a full minute before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." Those were 4 words I'd waited over 20 years to hear. He admitted he'd spent most of Vanessa's life giving in because arguing with her was exhausting. Every time she caused problems, he'd convinced himself keeping the peace was the easiest solution. Looking back, he realized all he'd really done was teach her that if she pushed hard enough, everyone else would eventually surrender. He said watching her try to take over my house had finally forced him to see how badly he'd failed both of us. I appreciated the apology, but I also told him the truth. One apology couldn't erase decades of being expected to compromise, while Vanessa never had to. If we were going to have a relationship moving forward, things had to change. He nodded and said he understood. My mother hugged me before leaving and quietly said she was proud that I had stood my ground, even if she'd been too afraid to support me at the beginning. Over the next few months, things slowly settled down. Vanessa eventually accepted a full-time office job through one of Richard's former co-workers. Between her income and child support that she finally pursued through the courts, she was able to rent a small townhouse for herself and the kids. It wasn't the large suburban home she'd wanted, but it was hers. We haven't spoken since the day she tried to move into my house. She never apologized, and honestly, I stopped expecting one a long time ago. Richard and I have slowly rebuilt our relationship. It isn't perfect, but it's honest for the first time I can remember. He no longer asks me to keep the peace simply because it's easier. My mother still visits every few weeks, although now she calls before coming over, and she no longer keeps a spare key to my house. That wasn't meant as punishment. It was simply a boundary I needed after everything that happened. As for me, my life is surprisingly peaceful again. The house is still exactly where it was before all of this started, only now it has security cameras and new locks. Sometimes relatives still ask whether I regret refusing to help because of the children. My answer is always the same. I never refused to help because there were children. I refused because helping someone should never require surrendering your home, your boundaries, and your self-respect to a person who spent a lifetime insisting you weren't family until they needed something you owned. Looking back, I don't think the house was ever the real issue. The house was just the final test. The real question was whether I was finally willing to stop sacrificing my own peace to make everyone else's life easier. For the first time in my life, my answer was no, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made.